Hello, I'm Mishka, and this then is the second part in the second episode of this the Langlois show that I started doing, and I felt somewhat badly about not trying to do this in the space of one video, but it's just my attempt at trying to meet some hypothetical audiences halfway, because it just seems that the data is in, and that both the YouTube algorithm and the audiences themselves greatly prefer the kind of situation where there's brief, compact videos about some extremely specific subject rather than longer podcast form videos that might cover a multitude of subjects over sometimes several hours of duration with a podcast or live stream. But the audiences and algorithms seem to favor the more compact form, and I'm considering giving it a chance, and I suppose this is then that. But anyway, the first video wasn't necessarily the most Langlois-esque of endeavors, except that it's potentially Langlois to then give this kind of a total global library of art some sort of a chance, and to invest one's attention and some levels of devotion to art from wherever it might come. So perhaps there's some general case to be made there, and so on. And you know, as I suggested in the first episode of the Langlois show, that there is this situation that Henri Langlois was traveling around the world looking for copies for the Cinémathèque Française, and you know, obviously that's a very real-world example of taking interest in multiple kinds of culture zones and whatnot. So I don't know, perhaps there's some argument to be made about that. But this second part, I hope that gets a bit deeper into the kind of practical side of the history of cinema, and obviously as such maybe rather more obviously Langlois-esque as a general endeavor. But anyway, so in that first part that I did, there was this discussion about the qualitative and the quantitative side having a certain kind of statistical objectivity to them as to how it is that different film scenes might be regarded, and then if somebody was inclined to do some quote power rankings unquote to the different film scenes, they might use some semi-objective kind of a baseline of historical data to justify the various positionings. So basically I feel like to just kind of vaguely say qualitative and quantitative, perhaps this video can offer a greater level of precision than that earlier one. So I would outline a kind of a more elaborate, sophisticated way of distinguishing why it is that one film scene is somehow bigger and doing more and getting more attention and regard than another. So I'm prepared to, in this video, outline that kind of a you know, again, there's an objective baseline to all of this, but it's also, you know, kind of entwined with a certain kind of subjectivity. But I'm just trying to establish a certain kind of common framework that different individuals from different walks of life can sort of understand, was it like, to use somewhat John Cheeverian language of what we talk about when we talk about classics, and then why it is that some things are classics and so on. So to kind of lay framework like that down, I suppose, is sort of the subject of this video. So anyway, I've said it before, but I think it can be said again, that I think when looking at the history of cinema, it should be broken down to 4 distinct eras, and it's just easier to orient oneself over the kind of long lines of history, and obviously looking at what culture zones genuinely have a tradition of quality that extends deep in the past. So the 4 eras of the history of cinema, I'm arguing, are first the silent era, second the golden age of the studio systems, the third would be the new wave era, and the fourth would be the home video era. So the silent film era is the most straightforward. It's from the beginning of cinema as an industrial process to the introduction of sound in the industrial process. So there's not necessarily any obvious reason to draw a line at the introduction of sound, because it's not as if cinema instantly jumped into any kind of golden age position when sound was there. Arguably, the first years of sound being introduced it worked as kind of a step back, in that silent films had reached a sophistication of sorts, and when people moved into doing talkies, as far as the entirety of the industry was concerned, the first years of talkies were rather crude. So from that standpoint, it doesn't necessarily make sense to draw the line at the first years of talkies, but it also is a bit silly to attach some talkies to the silent era. So that's basically the rationale. So anyway, the silent film era is pretty self-explanatory. Now, why it is that anyone would call the pre-New Wave studio era as the golden age? Well, quite simply, that was the age where the studio systems had the most money. So it was the pre-television era, and it being the pre-television era, cinema had less competition, so all of the money that right now is divided on some sort of pie chart over so many different arts and entertainment operators, cinema got basically all of that money on that pie chart. And as cinema was in such a financially independent position, they could take any amount of risks, they could invest in whatever they wanted to, and there would just be money, flying through all doors and windows, in that whatever Hollywood was doing, the Japanese, the French, the Finnish industries in the golden age, they were just effectively guaranteed profitability in their golden age. And basically that financial independence gradually segued into higher quality artistry, because there was just John Milius is an American screenwriter and director, and he said that in his youth, when he was coming to his own as an artist in Hollywood, he said that Hollywood was ruled by the spirit of adventure. There was this kind of a shared enthusiasm and this spirit of wanting to do something great together. That was the John Milius assessment. And then he said that now in his old age, he sees Hollywood ruled by a spirit of fear, i.e. spirit of going bankrupt, spirit of fearing that you're heading towards some sort of a bad investment and so on. So basically, the golden age of Hollywood, it had, in a manner of speaking, the spirit of adventure. Now obviously the Hays Code, for example, took certain kind of adventures off the board, but clever directors and other cast and crew members were able to work around the Hays Code. But basically, the financial independence, relatively speaking, the financial security is what created the golden ages in the countries that had it in the pre-television era. And obviously television just started the kind of splintering of the visual storytelling scene, and it's only accentuated in recent times that cinema's pie chart dominance is lesser every passing year, and there's projections where cinema isn't even in any kind of leading position some decades into the future, that there's every possibility that various kind of streaming-based platforms can overtake actually having the kind of bigger pie chart slice that cinema used to have. So basically that's kind of a requirement for the golden age, so that the great financial security led to a greater amount of classics than any other decade could produce. So if I said that United States, Japan, France and Finland, for example, are kind of classic cases of a golden age happening at the same time, for the same reason. No competition meant financial security. Financial security meant kind of this greater daring with investments, and greater daring with investments meant greater movies than the other eras ruled by what Milius labeled as the spirit of fear. Just couldn't again produce outside some maverick individuals, either working inside the system or outside it in independent sector, either way. But then again, the new wave era is pretty clear cut in how it's defined. So the new wave is named after a French film movement of the Nouvelle Vague that started out as the generation that was coming to the film scene in late 1950s, early 1960s for some slightly different reasons. They either didn't want to meekly coexist inside the studio system, whether there were such things as the Hollywood Hays Code, like let's say moralistic based restrictions, or whether there was something some other reason. But the younger generation of directors coming around 1959 in France and then later elsewhere as well, they wanted the greater plane to the artistry, where they would have kind of a more ultimate liberty to do something that seemed most personally significant to them. And this kind of a slightly more rebellious generation of high-profile artists as directors came to then define the New Wave era. Now, the New Wave era, obviously the French New Wave started, let's draw the beginning at 1959, and then the French New Wave inspired some other very comparable New Wave movements in there's the Japanese New Wave, there's the Brazilian Cinema Novo, there's the Czechoslovakian New Wave. In Finland, there was kind of a clumsy attempt at having the kind of French-style New Wave movement from the young directors of that particular era. So there were some New Wave movements that were on the same timeline as France, so that situations were happening simultaneously, so that Glauber Rocha from Brazil was an immediate contemporary of Jean-Luc Godard, and Nagisa Oshima and Shohei Imamura were near contemporaries of these individuals like Milos Forman or Jörn Donner in Finland or François Truffaut in France. So there were these contemporary New Wave movements. Britain had their free cinema movement, which to me, it's called the British New Wave, but I would say that it's aesthetically different from this other New Wave movement. To me, it seems like a neo-realist revival, but it's seen as part of the same continuum of the young generation of artists wishing to stand apart of the kind of comparatively homogenized way of creation inside the studio system of the Golden Age. So young directors just didn't want to become the David Lean or the Billy Wilder. They, well, no pun intended, but wanted to be something even wilder. And as such, all of the John Slade, František Vlačius, and all the rest in these various movements during the New Wave era, they just had a kind of a secessionist movement from what was up until that point considered the tradition of quality. And then there became this kind of a I guess fork in the road situation with this this kind of how it is that the film scene regarded itself, because in the Golden Age there was a very specific standard for quality, and this New Wave era endeavored to create a paradigm shift, so that individuals such as Chantal Akerman certainly couldn't have been regarded as purveyors of the highest quality in the age dominated by the comparatively homogeneous standard of the studio system, but the disruption caused by these young directors in the New Wave era created enough of a paradigm shift so that if essentially this kind of two paths started diverging, there had been an art house side of tracks in cinema before the New Wave era, but the New Wave era arguably brought it to the very mainstream, so that somebody like Jean-Luc Godard could collaborate with, say, the Rolling Stones or something, which, obviously not being quite on the same par as far as cultural relevance was concerned, but like enough in the mainstream understandings that the scale of production was a mainstream scale, whereas whatever was happening in the art house pre 1959, it was very much the kind of this Stendhalian idea of doing something for the happy few, much as art house has been once more abandoned to the happy few. But in this New Wave era, art house briefly, when the Anglo-American and other Western studio system, when the studio system lost the greatest amount of young talent to the art house sphere, that was effectively what created this kind of situation that in the early 1960s, it was kind of an all-time low for the studio era situation and an all-time high for the independent mavericks, which created this kind of a quirky art scene for the overall global culture. And then later on, some other new wave-like movements happened that stopped being on the same timeline as the French-led culture scene. The new American cinema and the new German cinema, for example, it was noticeably later to the scene than those who started in 1959. So Germany would have their own new wave-like generation with the Wim Wenders, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Volker Schlöndorff, Margaret von Trotta, those kinds of individuals, and then United States obviously has a legendary generation of director talent in the new American cinema with Spielberg, Lucas, Coppola, Scorsese, De Palma, and so on. There was this kind of a leveling of the field that when the studio system had started going through a low point, in United States, for example, there was arguably this kind of a conflation of the two different European paths, so that either you were an independent maverick in the art house lane or you were a meek studio director. That in United States they were able to have the mavericks inside the studio system, and an argument could be made that there was this kind of a roaring 20s like party of mavericks being the prince of the city in Hollywood until Michael Cimino had a high profile flop that got some studios rethinking their stance about just how much they want to give these young guys liberties and taking wild artistic risks and gambles, and the party was drawing to a close anyway, but some of the greatest classics of American cinema were happening in that new American cinema scene where Sidney Lumet was doing Dog Day Afternoon, Coppola was doing Godfather, Milos Forman emigrated to United States and did One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, for example. There is a certain kind of a reason why it is that the low point of the studio system basically creates this kind of situation that the new wave era is seen as not necessarily one that has a higher quality contribution than any other era as far as artistry is concerned, but things were done for slightly different kind of reasons. What John Milius referred to as the spirit of adventure. Perhaps the new wave era had the greatest kind of spirit of adventure still ultimately out of all of these eras, and it just couldn't really be recreated once the studio systems were able to regather themselves once the home video era created this kind of a new paradigm of plurality of income streams. So basically there's this idea that when a Hollywood studio makes a movie, they are heavily investing in the theatrical run. So if a movie costs $150 million, they might spend another $150 million on the marketing purely to launch the product to the market. And then with multiple income streams, they get money from the theatrical run, they get money selling it to the foreign markets, they get money selling it to television rights, home video rights, unless they're releasing it themselves, the streaming rights, there's licensing rights, and this kind of plurality of the income streams is what's starting to redefine the home video era, and it's the studio system once more pushing the art house to the fringes of the scene, basically telling all high-profile directors that once again, the party's over. You have to acclimatize to the relatively homogeneous culture inside the studio system, where you're brought there effectively to do as you're told and to make the hits and not to waste the audience's time with any kind of risky business. So basically, studio system is, this home video era, which I propose is the fourth era of cinema. And you can call it the home video era or the modern era. I prefer using the home video era. Now, this is kind of like a slighter version of the golden age, in that structurally it's rather similar, except that now in this particular era, studios they are the kind of dominant presence in the market zone, but what is happening is that they are gun shy in a way that they weren't in the Michael Curtis era of the golden age of Hollywood, in that Hollywood is so much more schematic and marketing oriented, because they are gambling with such huge amounts of money that they just feel, for whatever reason, compelled to play everything extra safe all the time, and it is creating kind of a tonal, flat aesthetic for the entirety of the home video era. Now, of course, not every country is on the same timeline as United States, and not every film culture moves in such a manner. So basically what has happened with every other culture zone in this home video era is that once the new wave brought this kind of art house lane and the mainstream lane, basically what is happening is that quite a fair amount of film production countries, they have an equal amount of directors for both lanes, so that some talent goes to the mainstream lane, just doing whatever it is that the studios deem profitable, and then some artists are trying to keep the art house relevant and so on. So sometimes you have some individuals crisscrossing between that situation to varying kinds of success, but in Europe, the shift from the new wave era to the new mainstream resurgence of the home video era, it's not quite as stark as in some countries like United States, but I would say that it still makes sense to draw the line there when the home video era started in the late 80s, because for instance, when I initially made my videos about the Finnish new wave, I couldn't quite insist strongly enough on the kind of idea that Finnish new wave could be argued to be a two-part movement, in that the first Jörn Donner, Risto Jarva, Mikko Niskanen, the kind of early French and Czechoslovakian and British free cinema inspired new wave. That was but then this kind of latter new wave situation that people like Aki Kaurismäki and Olli Soinia and Rauni Mulbari are representing. It is still inarguably, I would say, filmmaking that owes everything to the global new wave movement. So the Fassbinder and Herzog type new German cinema contribution, some Arthur Penn Night Moves type, or The Long Goodbye by Robert Altman, like that kind of new American cinema, and then all the Godards and Oshimas and all the rest of the global scene in that it was still kind of a generational thing that even in early 80s, when some individuals such as Aki Kaurismäki were coming to the scene in Finland, it was still very evident that these were part of the artists for whom the French New Wave defined how it was to be a success story. So, there are some slight aesthetic differences between, say, Bernardo Bertolucci or Pierpaolo Pasolini from Italy and, say, Herzog and Wenders from Germany. Like, there's some slight aesthetic differences, but it was basically a generation where everyone needed to adjust based on what the French New Wave did to the film scene, and basically created this kind of a secondary, wilder mainstream, and sometimes even in the New American cinema context were able to kind of turn this American mainstream into a wilder version than what it used to be, and so on. But then when the next generation started coming to its own, the people who were young adults in late 80s who started coming to the industry in like early 90s and started perhaps approaching their prime in like late 90s, early 2000s, that generation, they were no longer similarly they had already grown up into this kind of new paradigm where like in a country like Finland or Poland or Greece or Spain or wherever, like you'd have the mainstream stuff that there might be like a Penelope Cruz romantic comedy, but then you'd have the art house lane where you might make some very experimental situation, and that it would be equally fine for a young director to go either. Like that was the post-French New Wave era, and people didn't really have comparable personal affiliations with the New Wave era, and as such, even in Europe, that doesn't have a comparably dominant mainstream, it still makes sense to draw the line at something like 1980, 83, 84, 85. That's where the New Wave eras officially ended. And I realized that some people want to talk about, say, Iranian New Wave or South Korean New Wave or Taiwanese New Wave. I realized that, but it's not really. The timeline is difficult to fit, although with the South Korean situation, for instance, if there would be some kind of a socio-political glasnost-like conditions where it's as if a Hays Code-like situation is lifted and artists are able to break in and do things like 1959 France, that these young mavericks started doing something wilder. I understand why the situation is analogous. It's just kind of difficult to treat a new wave movement inside the home video era, which is why I'd rather kind of ignore some of that just to make this general cataloging kind of clear for everybody. So anyway, now I established why there are 4 eras of cinema and why it is that they had some of the characteristics that they did have. Now, obviously, when thinking of heavyweight countries, welterweight countries, featherweight countries, lightweight countries, I would say that one of the hallmarks of the heavyweight countries is that they have contribution throughout all of the eras of cinema. So obviously, like, I don't know what Romania did during the silent film era. I don't know what Portugal did during the silent film era. I don't know what Belgium did during the silent film era. So because that is kind of in obscurity, that's why I think that their claim for even welterweight status is a bit difficult. There's the four eras of cinema to be considered as which countries have a tradition of quality that genuinely extends rather deep in the past. So obviously that's a cataloging reality to be confronted. So that's the purely temporal objective reality. And then another objective reality I think can be said is this kind of orientation of the industry. So let's say that cinema is further broken into eras, but also into categories of kind of cinema. So let's say that there's the mainstream cinema sector. Let's say it has an adjacent art house cinema sector and an adjacent genre cinema sector. So what I'm suggesting is that something like Lucio Fulci movies in Italy, they aren't quite mainstream, but they aren't quite art house either. So that's why there would be a third category of films marketed specifically for niche genre audiences. So the three obvious levels to the kind of cataloging of cinema, I would suggest are purely mainstream audiences marketed to the everyman, art house audiences marketed to the fans of art house, which is a special interest group, and genre cinema marketed to fans of genre cinema, which again is a special interest group. And thus ineligible for the mainstream, because one of the intrinsic elements of the mainstream is that it seeks to make anyone and everyone into a potential viewer regardless of their differences. There's a greater kind of homogeneity in the mainstream, whereas genre cinema and art house cinema can be indeed wildly heterogeneous as far as the kind of tonal consistency of the culture is concerned. So that somebody like Abbas Kiarostami and somebody like Dusan Makaveyev, that they don't need to have anything particularly in common as far as the aesthetic is concerned. It's just the refusal to acclimatize to the mainstream is what creates the art house lane, and creates kind of unity in there so that you can speak about it as a specific tradition, that there's a kind of objective level to cataloging it. Those are the easiest to talk about, the mainstream, the art house, and the genre cinema. But I would suggest that then you need to create some kind of lanes for independent and experimental cinema. Now, these are lanes that they are the most they're the most obscure, and there's like if art house and genre cinema are special interest groups only, effectively speaking. Independent cinema and experimental cinema are similarly for special interest groups only, but the difference is that they enjoy the fraction of the audiences that even something like Lucio Fulci or Abbas Kiarostami movies have. So that they are technically there in the film landscape, but they are effectively ignored by everyone. And perhaps some kind of amateur cinema lane can be another situation, that they are technically there, the audiences just effectively aren't. So that's why you distinguish between them. But basically, then when we are combining these two frameworks that I decided, so that I'm suggesting that there's a mainstream, an art house, and a genre lane for every era of cinema. So in the silent era, some were doing genre movies, some were doing mainstream movies, some were doing art house movies. In the golden age, again, some were doing mainstream, some were doing genre, some were doing art house, and of course independent and experimental as well. But like you start forming this kind of a grid over cinema history in that there's 4 eras and different lanes in each era, and then this kind of objective cataloging principle is that we merely go and look at how it is that Polish cinema, for instance, distributes its significant movies, so that how many significant global releases can Poland have from the silent film era, from the mainstream, from the art house to the genre lane, and how many golden age, so mid 1930s to late 1950s, how many golden age releases does Spain produce from the mainstream lane, from the genre lane, from the art house lane and independent experimental and so on. And then again, the sheer quantity of films listed from say the 1930s to late 50s from Spain is that we start having certain kind of objective volume of contribution, and then that gets used cataloging. That the super heavyweight is obviously in a league of its own, but then heavyweights should have comparable volume to one another, making it kind of an interchangeable subjective evaluation in ranking, and then welterweight should have comparable volume, and so on. And basically that's just me outlining a suggestion of how to try and establish a common core of objectivity with the kind of criteria for cataloging and for reasoning of positioning in weight classes and so on. And then the rest obviously is subjective. But I'm suggesting that there's also kind of an objective reality to something being an export item, in that I'm suggesting that a film cannot be very formidable if no one is willing to export it. So basically, obviously every scene plays locally, but that's the same for heavyweights and lightweights. So you need to do more than just the local to move up in weight classes. And again, I'm just outlining kind of a shared system, if you will, of how to regard classics and how to regard film scenes. So I hope that viewers got something out of this, and if you like this video, I hope you'll consider liking some of the earlier videos that are there on this channel. That's what they're there for. But anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and bye bye.